They thought no one would ever care. In the cold silence of the woods, a cruel voice echoed, sharp as a knife. "This is where you belong, tied up in the dark, just like your kind should be." Alicia and Clara, a teenage girl and a 60-year-old janitor, bound to a tree, shivering as night fell. To the boys in red hoodies, it was just another game. But behind this cruelty lay a story that would shake an entire town. What would you have done if you had seen them that night? Share your thoughts in the comments. If stories of silent heroes and hidden kindness matter to you, stay with us, because this one will touch your soul. Thank you for watching, and may your day be filled with light and strength. The morning sun rose gently over Maple Ridge, painting the rooftops of the small town in shades of gold and amber. It was a quiet place compared to the bustling streets of Atlanta, where Alicia Carter had lived all her life. Now, standing at the gates of Maple Ridge High, her heart thumped nervously in her chest. She was 15, a black girl with tightly braided hair pulled neatly into a bun, her backpack hanging slightly loose over one shoulder. This was her first day at a new school, and though her mother's encouraging words echoed in her head, Alicia felt every pair of eyes watching as she walked across the courtyard. Inside the school, the hallways were a blur of chatter and footsteps. The division was clear almost instantly. Groups of white students clustered confidently near lockers, laughing and greeting each other with high fives, while the few black students kept to themselves, exchanging cautious glances. Alicia adjusted her books and pressed forward, determined not to show her unease. She found her way to her first class, English, and chose a seat in the middle row safe, not too forward, not too hidden. The room was buzzing until the teacher, Mrs. Peterson, entered and called for quiet. She was a thin woman with kind eyes who smiled warmly at Alicia. "Class, we have a new student joining us today. Would you like to introduce yourself?" The question felt like a weight pressing against Alicia's ribs, but she stood anyway, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "My name is Alicia Carter. My family just moved here from Atlanta." She managed a polite smile and sat back down, trying to appear composed. But before the teacher could continue, snickering rose from the back. 3 boys in red hoodies lounged like they owned the room. Ethan Cole, tall and wiry, leaned back with a smirk, his brown hair falling over sharp eyes. Ryan Walker, with spiked blonde hair and a cocky grin, elbowed his friend and whispered something cruel. Kyle Bennett, broad-shouldered and heavy-set, cracked his gum loudly and chuckled, his arms crossed over his chest. They were the type who thrived on attention, and they had found a new target. The teacher snapped at them to be quiet, but their laughter lingered, poisoning the air. Alicia lowered her gaze, her cheeks burning. It was her first day, and already she felt the sting of rejection. She turned her focus to the open page of her notebook, determined not to cry. The morning dragged on with little relief. In each class, the trio's presence followed her knocked books, whispered slurs, mocking glances. By the time lunch came, Alicia felt the weight of the entire school pressing down on her. It was in that moment that Clara Johnson entered her life. Clara, 60 years old, was the school's janitor, a black woman whose quiet resilience was etched into every line on her face. She was of medium build, with short curly gray hair tucked under a plain navy cap, dressed in the navy uniform of her work, heavy keys jangling at her side. She pushed a mop bucket into the classroom just as Ethan extended his foot to trip Alicia, his friends already laughing in anticipation. The sound of metal clattering against tile snapped every head around. Clara's voice was calm but sharp, the kind of tone that silenced even the boldest student. "That's enough!" She didn't shout, but the authority in her eyes left no room for challenge. For the first time that day, Alicia felt the faint flicker of safety. The boys stiffened, embarrassed to be checked in front of their peers, but they didn't retaliate immediately. They slouched back into their seats, hiding their scowls, while Clara resumed her quiet work, her mop sliding rhythmically across the floor. Alicia glanced at her with gratitude, but Clara only offered a brief nod before moving on. For Clara, standing up wasn't about recognition. It was instinct. She had seen too many children hurt by cruelty, and she would not allow it to happen in front of her eyes. Yet, what seemed like a small victory planted a seed of humiliation in Ethan and his gang. Later that afternoon, while the halls thinned between classes, Clara was again at her work. She crouched by her bucket, scrubbing stubborn stains from the tiles, the keys at her belt jingling softly. From the corner, the 3 boys approached, their grins wide with mischief. With a sudden shove, Ryan kicked at the bucket, sending water cascading across the floor. The soapy water spread in a slick sheet, and Clara slipped, landing hard on her side. The sound of her keys skittering echoed down the hall as laughter erupted. Ethan leaned against a locker, arms folded, smirking with satisfaction. Kyle's booming laugh filled the corridor as he slapped his thigh. To them, this was payback, making sure Clara knew her place. Alicia, emerging from class, froze as she saw the scene unfold. Her heart clenched. Clara struggled to push herself up, her hands damp and raw from the fall. Alicia's father's voice echoed in her memory, a reminder he had repeated countless times. Stand tall, keep your head high, never let anyone dim your light. She rushed forward, stooping to pick up Clara's scattered keys, handing them back silently. Their eyes met. Clara's filled with quiet pain but also with unyielding strength, Alicia's brimming with a mix of anger and determination. Neither spoke, but the bond between them deepened in that moment. Clara accepted the keys with a small nod, brushing herself off with dignity despite the boys' laughter. The bell rang, scattering students. The trio walked off, still jeering, leaving Clara with damp clothes and a bruised hip. Alicia lingered by her side, hesitant but unwilling to leave her alone. The hallway, once filled with cruel laughter, now seemed oddly silent. Clara, still in her janitor's uniform, straightened her back. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice low but steady. Alicia didn't reply. She only stayed close until Clara resumed her work, each mop stroke carrying both resilience and quiet defiance. When the final bell dismissed the school, Alicia waited by the entrance. Clara eventually emerged, but this time she was no longer in her work uniform. She had changed into her modest everyday clothes, an old brown cardigan buttoned loosely, gray slacks worn at the knees, and black flats. She looked less like the janitor the students ignored and more like a grandmother from the neighborhood, someone warm and approachable. Alicia fell into step beside her as they walked toward the gates. The air was cooler now, the sun dipping lower over Maple Ridge, casting long shadows across the pavement. Students passed by with sideways glances, but Alicia didn't care. She chose to walk with Clara, a quiet act of defiance in itself. To her, Clara wasn't just the janitor who had stepped in when no one else would. She was proof that even in the loneliest moments, kindness could take root. And for Clara, the simple companionship of a young girl by her side reminded her that her work, often thankless and invisible still, had the power to touch lives in ways no paycheck ever could. That evening, as the two parted ways, Alicia carried with her not just the weight of another difficult day, but also a flicker of hope. Clara's quiet strength had shown her that dignity could withstand cruelty. And though she sensed more trials ahead, Alicia promised herself she would remember this day, the day she found an unexpected ally in the most ordinary of places. The final bell at Maple Ridge High rang out with a hollow echo, and students poured from the classrooms like restless birds released from a cage. Alicia Carter walked among them, her steps quick but heavy, each glance from her peers a reminder of the laughter that had followed her all day. Clara Johnson lingered behind, her mop and bucket stored away for the night, her knees still aching from the fall that had humiliated her hours before. Alicia slowed, unwilling to let the older woman walk home alone, and when their eyes met in the corridor, something unspoken passed between them. They both knew danger still hung in the air, and though silence cloaked them, their steps became a fragile alliance against what waited beyond the school's walls. The air outside was sharp with late autumn chill, the sky already sinking into a bruised purple. Instead of taking this main road where groups of students still lingered, Alicia suggested they cut through the wooded path that led toward their neighborhood, a shortcut she had discovered earlier in the week. Clara agreed with a weary nod. Her pride stung too raw to endure more stares and whispers at the school gate. The forest's edge beckoned with a deceptive calm, its trees tall and skeletal, branches stripped bare by the season. Fallen leaves crunched beneath their feet, each sound swallowed quickly by the deepening quiet, as though the woods themselves were holding their breath. But Maple Ridge was a small town, and grudges traveled faster than whispers. Waiting along the narrow trail were three silhouettes draped in crimson, their hoodies glowing faintly in the dimming light. Ethan Cole leaned casually against the trunk of an oak, his wiry frame and sly grin stretched wide, eyes narrowing into slits of amusement. Ryan Walker twirled a baseball cap in his hand, the smug curl of his lips betraying a boy who had never faced consequence thanks to his father's badge. Kyle Bennett, broad and hulking, chewed his gum with exaggerated snaps, arms crossed over his chest like a gatekeeper. Their laughter rumbled low before spilling into the clearing, cruel and eager, and Alicia felt her chest tighten at the sight. Clara stepped slightly in front of Alicia, her limp betraying the pain still throbbing in her leg. She carried no weapon, no shield, only the dignity of a woman who had endured a lifetime of slights. But the boys saw her defiance as nothing more than fuel. Ethan's voice broke the stillness first, laced with scorn, his words aimed like arrows. Ryan added his sharp laugh, circling closer, while Kyle moved with the confidence of brute force. Alicia clutched the straps of her backpack, her pulse hammering, but her feet rooted to the ground. In that frozen instant, she realized the trap had been set long before they left the school. The attack came swiftly. Too swift for either Clara or Alicia to resist. Ethan lunged forward, yanking Alicia's backpack from her shoulders and hurling it to the dirt where it split open, notebooks scattering like wounded birds. Ryan pushed Clara back against a tree, his laugh high-pitched and triumphant, while Kyle pulled a coarse rope from his jacket pocket, the kind used for hauling lumber or binding cargo. Alicia's arms flailed in protest, but the boys were stronger, their grip rough and unyielding, and Clara's attempt to shield her only earned a shove that sent her stumbling into the leaves. The rope wound around them both, loop after loop, until their chests strained against the fibers and their breaths came short. Kyle cinched the knot with a cruel jerk, the hemp biting into Alicia's thin jacket and Clara's cardigan alike. Ryan shoved a rag across Clara's mouth, muffling the cry that rose in her throat, and Ethan forced another into Alicia's, the bitter taste of dirt and oil flooding her tongue. Their muffled protests drew only laughter, Ethan tossing his snapback higher on his head with mock pride. The boys stepped back to admire their work, 3 predators pleased with their catch, the pale light of dusk washing their faces in shadows that made them appear older, crueler, as though cruelty itself had aged them beyond their years. The woods absorbed the sound of their departure, branches rattling as they disappeared down the path, their laughter lingering like smoke in the air. Silence reclaimed the clearing, but it was not peace. It was a silence weighted with fear and the sharp sting of helplessness. Alicia pressed against the bark, rough edges digging into her back, her fingers numb where they strained against the rope. Beside her, Clara's breath came ragged, her leg trembling with pain, but she tilted her head, eyes steady, as though willing Alicia to hold on. The bond between them, forged in the day's cruelty, tightened in that darkening hour. Night fell like a curtain, heavy and merciless. The temperature dropped, each gust of wind slicing through their thin clothes and setting their teeth chattering. Alicia's ears filled with the sound of her own breath, shallow and desperate, and the faint rustle of unseen creatures moving through the underbrush. The gag chafed against her lips, soaking quickly with tears she could no longer hold back, and she thought of her mother's warm hand that morning, her father's voice reminding her of strength. Yet here, tied and silenced, the memory felt like a fragile flame flickering against a storm. Minutes stretched into hours, every second a cruel reminder of their captivity. Alicia's muscles cramped from struggling against the rope, each attempt leaving her weaker, while Clara shifted slightly, testing the knot, her face etched with pain, but her resolve unbroken. The cold seeped deeper, gnawing at their bones, making shivers turn violent. Above them, the branches clashed in the wind, and each creak of the wood seemed to echo their own fragility. Time lost its meaning. What mattered was only the endurance of the next breath, the next heartbeat, the hope that someone might stumble upon their prison before the night consumed them whole. Alicia closed her eyes and imagined her father's arms, strong and certain, imagined his voice telling her she was not alone. She imagined her mother's smile, the warmth of home, the comfort of safety, but the visions blurred with the sting of reality. Clara shifted again, pressing her shoulder against Alicia's as if to remind her that survival was not an individual fight, but something they would endure together. The rope held fast, the cold gnawed deeper, and the forest whispered with indifference. In the darkness of Maple Ridge Woods, 2 figures remained bound, trembling, but not yet broken. Night in Maple Ridge grew heavier with each passing hour, the woods swallowing sound until the crunch of hurried footsteps broke the silence. A man in his late 50s, broad-shouldered though slightly stooped with age, was jogging along the trail for exercise when his flashlight beam cut through the trees. Mr. Harold Thompson, a retired factory worker with a rugged face weathered by years of labor, froze when the light fell upon two figures bound cruelly to an oak. Their arms strained against rope, mouths gagged, bodies shivering violently in the biting cold. His chest tightened with shock, and without hesitation he rushed forward, voice trembling as he muttered, "Oh my Lord." Thompson's hands shook as he pulled out his cell phone, dialing 911 with urgency. His voice carried desperation as he explained what he had found, giving directions with clarity forged by panic. He worked quickly, tugging at the gags, easing them loose enough for Clara to breathe more easily while Alicia's tear-streaked face broke his heart. He dared not untie the ropes fully, fearing he might worsen their injuries, but he spoke softly, reassuring them that help was coming. The flashlight beam quivered as it illuminated the angry red welts carved into their skin, a sight that made his stomach churn. Sirens pierced the night, first distant, then growing louder until flashing red and blue lights spilled across the tree line. Paramedics rushed forward, lifting Alicia and Clara gently, placing thermal blankets around their shoulders as oxygen masks covered their trembling faces. Clara's voice rasped through cracked lips, whispering gratitude, while Alicia could barely speak at all, her wide eyes glassy and stunned. The sound of Velcro straps and the hiss of oxygen filled the air as the medics worked, transferring them swiftly to stretchers and into the waiting ambulance. For Thompson, the relief was fleeting, replaced by a gnawing worry that this was only the beginning. At the hospital, the sterile glow of fluorescent lights bathed the corridor in cold white. Doctors examined the rope burns along Alicia's wrists and ribs, her breathing shallow but steady, while Clara was treated for bruises and a twisted ankle. Nurses moved with quiet efficiency, yet whispers spread quickly among staff about the brutality that had brought two vulnerable souls here tonight. Alicia lay on the narrow bed, her eyes staring at the ceiling, lips pressed tightly together, her silence more haunting than any scream. The trauma had locked her voice away, leaving only the trembling of her hands to betray the storm within. Outside the room, the police had gathered. Sheriff Wilkins, a man in his mid-50s with slicked-back gray hair, polished boots, and the easy arrogance of power, led the group. His cold blue eyes scanned the notes with indifference, his mouth set in a tight line that masked condescension. A deputy began to speak about what was found at the scene, but Wilkins cut him off with a dismissive gesture. "Boys being boys," he said, his voice low but sharp. Several officers exchanged uneasy glances, their expressions betraying sympathy, yet none dared to contradict the sheriff. His presence was a leash, tightening around their silence. One officer, younger than the rest with nervous eyes and a stiff posture, scribbled in his notebook, his jaw clenched as though he wanted to speak but could not. The official report was reduced to a few lines: 2 individuals tied, no severe injuries, possible prank gone too far. Wilkins signed it with a flourish, then turned on his heel, his authority absolute. The deputy folded the paper away, and the momentary chance for justice dissolved into the sterile air. Clara, overhearing fragments from her bed, clenched her hands, but the weight of exhaustion silenced her protest. Alicia, too, caught the words and closed her eyes tightly, as if shutting out the world was the only defense left. The hospital corridor soon echoed with a different sound-measured, heavy footsteps, each one resonant with unspoken fury. David Carter, tall and broad-shouldered, his uniform still bearing the insignia of his Delta Force command, strode into the ward. His skin was dark, his jaw set, his eyes like tempered steel that revealed nothing yet promised everything. He had come straight from deployment, called home by a message no father should receive. When his gaze fell upon his daughter lying fragile beneath the hospital light, the hardness of a soldier gave way to the breaking heart of a father. Angela, his wife, stood quickly from the bedside, relief and sorrow etched across her face. David moved closer without a word, lowering himself beside Alicia. His hand hovered for a moment before he touched the bandages around her wrist, the sight of rope burns igniting a fury that did not show on his face but glimmered in the tightening of his jaw. He said nothing, yet his silence was thunder. His eyes fixed on the marks as though memorizing every wound. Alicia turned her head slowly, whispering only one word: "Dad." And in that broken syllable, the air between them filled with grief and resolve. Elsewhere in Maple Ridge, a small apartment light flickered as Maria Sanchez, 26, sat at her desk littered with old newspapers and a battered laptop. Her dark hair fell in loose curls over her shoulders, her eyes sharp with curiosity, and her fingers moved quickly across the keyboard. A junior reporter for the Maple Ridge Chronicle, Maria had been chasing whispers for months about unchecked violence in the high school, complaints dismissed without consequence. Tonight, the hospital incident came to her through a hurried phone call from a contact on the inside. The words, "two victims tied to a tree," froze her breath, and she knew instinctively this was more than an isolated act of cruelty. Maria scribbled notes on a yellow pad, the outline of a story taking shape. Teachers too afraid to speak on record, students whispering about intimidation, parents complaining about vanished reports. All of it pointed to something festering beneath the town's polished surface. Her eyes narrowed as she remembered Sheriff Wilkins at a council meeting, shaking hands with Councilman Hayes, the father of one of the red-hooded boys rumored to be behind the attack. She pressed record on her small voice recorder, whispering into it, "This is no prank. This is a pattern." The case of Alicia and Clara was no longer just a tragedy. It was the thread that could unravel a much darker tapestry. In the hospital room, David remained seated, unmoving, his hand resting gently on Alicia's blanket. Clara, in the next bed, turned her head to watch him, and in his stillness, she recognized a man who had faced wars but now confronted a different battlefield. The machines beeped steadily, the nurses moved quietly, but in that room, an invisible vow was being forged. David Carter had returned not only as a father but as a soldier, prepared to uncover truth where others looked away. And though the night outside pressed dark and heavy against the windows, within the room a fire had been lit, one that would not be extinguished. The hospital room was quiet save for the steady hum of machines and the faint murmur of nurses in the corridor. Yet David Carter's mind refused to rest. He had seen his daughter's wrists bound raw, had heard the casual dismissal of law officers who called it a prank, and every instinct in him told him the truth was being buried under layers of influence. In the dim light of dawn, while Alicia finally drifted into shallow sleep, he slipped from the room, the soldier in him already preparing for a different kind of mission, one fought not on foreign soil but in the streets of Maple Ridge. David's black SUV idled at the curb that evening, its windows tinted dark. From inside, he watched Brandon Hayes swagger out of a gas station with his friends, their laughter spilling into the night as they shoved snacks into their jackets without paying. The small clerk behind the counter glanced nervously toward the street, but when Ryan flashed the sheriff's badge hanging from a chain around his neck, the man looked away. David adjusted the focus of his camera, capturing every detail, the smirk on Ethan's face as he kicked over a display stand, Kyle's heavy fist pounding on the hood of a parked car for no reason but cruelty. The lens clicked softly, but in David's mind each frame was a weapon, each moment evidence. Following from a careful distance, he traced their movements across town. The boys crowded into Brandon's red Camaro, the roar of its engine splitting the quiet night, and David's tracker blinked steadily on his screen. He had slipped the device under the rear bumper days before, a precaution now proving essential. Through winding streets and back alleys, he followed until the car screeched to a halt near a shuttered grocery. In the pale glow of the street lamp, Brandon pulled a crowbar from the trunk, and within minutes, the boys were forcing their way inside. David's chest tightened as glass shattered and laughter echoed, the sound mingling with the crinkle of stolen bags and the fizz of beer cans cracked open. He recorded it all, his jaw locked, knowing the police would never write a line of this into their reports. Back in his study that night, the glow of his laptop lit his face as he sifted through public archives and buried files. David had spent years analyzing intelligence in war zones, and now those same skills revealed a different battlefield. He unearthed vandalism complaints filed by local shopkeepers, missing police reports on schoolyard assaults, and records of juvenile arrests that simply vanished from the system. Each file bore a pattern, each silence a price paid. Bank transfers from Councilman Richard Hayes appeared in city ledgers days after every scandal, always routed toward the sheriff's office budget or through shell charities Wilkins conveniently chaired. The numbers formed a grim rhythm. Crime, silence, payment. Meanwhile, Clara Johnson sat at her kitchen table, a single lamp illuminating her tired face. 60 years had taught her to endure slights, but the memory of rope cutting into her ribs still burned. She held the phone with trembling hands, debating whether her voice could make a difference. Finally, she called the local paper and asked for Maria Sanchez, her words halting but resolute. "I saw it," Clara whispered, "and I won't pretend I didn't." Her courage came not from believing she was safe, but from knowing silence would make her complicit. Maria listened intently, her pen racing across the page, her young face tight with concentration. Only 26, with restless brown eyes and a voice always a little faster than her peers, she had grown up in Maple Ridge herself, watching her own brothers bullied with no intervention. For months, she had suspected corruption but lacked proof. Now, Clara's testimony gave her a thread, and she reached out to David Carter, knowing their paths were converging toward the same storm. The call came late, her voice steady but edged with urgency. "I think we need to talk." "You have evidence? I have reach. Together we can expose this." Bid met her the next day in the quiet corner of a diner off Main Street, a place where truckers nursed coffee at dawn and no one looked twice at whispered conversations. Maria arrived with her recorder tucked discreetly into her bag, her notepad already half filled with observations. She noticed the sharp creases in David's uniform, the steel in his posture, but also the weariness in his eyes, the weight of a father who had seen too much. He spread photographs across the table, Brandon's gang smashing windows, Ryan flashing his father's badge, Kyle pouring beer over a frightened freshman's head. Maria inhaled sharply, her suspicions confirmed with brutal clarity. The two of them pieced the puzzle together over hours of coffee gone cold. David revealed transfers and donation records, while Maria shared whispers from frightened parents and students too scared to step forward. Every shard of information clicked into place. Councilman Hayes funding the silence, Sheriff Wilkins enforcing it, Brandon and his crew terrorizing the school with impunity. Clara's account was the bridge between rumor and proof, the human face of cruelty that statistics could never capture. Maria's fingers tightened on her pen as she wrote, "This isn't negligence. This is a system." Back at the hospital, Alicia stirred restlessly in her bed, still haunted by the night in the woods. She asked her mother in a voice thin as thread, "Why did no one help us sooner?" Angela could not answer, only brushed her daughter's hair back with trembling hands. But Clara came to visit the next afternoon, leaning on her cane, her presence a quiet reassurance. She told Alicia gently that she had spoken out, that her suffering would not be erased. For the girl who had felt invisible, that promise mattered more than medicine. By the week's end, David had compiled a dossier thick with photographs, recordings, and financial records, every page a testament to corruption's reach. Maria prepared her article draft, weaving Clara's testimony with hard evidence, her sentences sharp but measured, designed to pierce denial and demand response. In the quiet of David's study, as Alicia sat nearby reading silently, the pieces lay spread across the table like a grim mosaic. What had begun as a father's fury and a janitor's courage had grown into something larger. The exposure of a network that thrived on silence. And though the fight was far from over, the truth was no longer hidden. It was waiting to be heard. The storm of silence had been broken, and the first light of dawn now revealed what had long been hidden beneath the surface of Maple Ridge. In the small newsroom of the River Valley Chronicle, Maria Sanchez pressed the final key on her laptop, sending her investigation out into the world. By sunrise, the story was live. Photographs of shattered windows, video recordings of drunken vandalism, audio capturing taunts spat in the woods, and financial records linking hush money from Councilman Hayes to the sheriff's office. The town awoke to the weight of its own secrets laid bare, and the shock rippled through every household like a sudden thunderclap. In classrooms and coffee shops, in grocery aisles and church steps, people read and whispered. Mothers clutched their children tighter, teachers stared at screens in disbelief, and old men shook their heads muttering that they had always suspected something was wrong. The Chronicle's website crashed under the volume of traffic, but the screenshots were already spreading from phone to phone, impossible to contain. On Main Street, neighbors gathered in small knots, their voices sharp with anger, grief, and shame. For the corruption was not just about a gang of boys, but about a community that had looked away too often. By noon, the school board had convened an emergency session in the gymnasium, the bleachers packed with townsfolk who refused to be left in the dark any longer. Principal Matthews sat stiffly at the table, his face pale under the fluorescent lights, while David Carter occupied the back row, silent but watchful. Maria stood near the front, recorder in hand, her presence a reminder that nothing said would remain hidden. When the board president announced that Brandon Hayes and his companions were suspended indefinitely pending criminal charges, the gym erupted in a roar, some with relief, others with outrage. The gavel pounded in vain, but the decision had already found its mark. The arrests came swiftly afterward. Sheriff deputies no longer under Wilkins' command escorted Ethan Cole, Ryan Walker, and Kyle Bennett from their homes in handcuffs, their once smug faces reduced to pale masks of fear. Brandon, caught last, spat curses at the cameras flashing outside City Hall, but his father's hands trembled visibly as he tried to shield him from the crowd. Reporters swarmed the steps, their microphones pointed at Councilman Hayes, demanding answers about payoffs and cover-ups. Hayes faltered, stammering rehearsed denials, until a federal warrant placed firmly in his hand stripped away the last of his bravado. Sheriff Wilkins fared no better. That same evening, the state troopers arrived at his office, their uniforms crisp, their voices clipped with authority. They relieved him of badge and weapon in front of his staff, and though he attempted to bluster, his words found no purchase. Officers who once bowed their heads now watched in silence as he was led away, their eyes betraying a mixture of anger and relief. The symbol of unchecked power had fallen, and with it came the first fragile breath of change. Days later, the high school auditorium filled once more, but this time for a very different occasion. Rows of students sat in hushed anticipation as the principal stepped onto the stage. His voice cracked as he issued a formal apology, not only to Alicia but also to Clara Johnson, the woman who had endured humiliation in silence for too long. Clara, dressed simply in her navy cardigan, rose from her seat with her cane in hand, and the entire auditorium stood with her. For the first time, applause did not feel hollow. It thundered through the hall, washing away years of disregard, and in that moment, Clara's tired eyes glistened not with fear but with vindication. From that day, the Clara Johnson Scholarship Fund was born, announced with a plaque unveiled on the very stage where she had been ignored before. Donations poured in from parents, teachers, and even businesses that once cowered under Hayes's influence. The fund was dedicated to students who, like Alicia, refused to bow to cruelty, and like Clara, dared to speak when silence was easier. Clara herself declined any spotlight, but the name she had carried quietly through years of labor now stood as a beacon of dignity. For Alicia, the change was felt most keenly in the simple act of walking through the school gates. Where once eyes averted or sneers lingered, now nods of respect and tentative smiles greeted her. Emma, the auburn-haired classmate who had once looked away, now walked beside her openly, a hand brushing hers in quiet solidarity. David and Angela watched from the distance, their daughter's shoulders no longer hunched, her steps steady, her head lifted high against the autumn sky. To them, victory was not only in the courtrooms or headlines, but in the quiet resilience etched onto Alicia's young face. Behind it all, Maria continued her work, penning follow-up articles as investigations widened, uncovering years of neglect and bribery that reached beyond the school walls. But in her heart, she knew this story was more than politics. It was about a father who refused to surrender, a girl who endured, and a janitor whose courage had sparked a fire. Clara, Alicia, and David had become symbols not by choice but by necessity, and their legacy would remain long after the headlines faded. On the final morning of that long season, the town gathered in the school courtyard for a community event. Children played under the banners strung between lampposts, parents exchanged cautious laughter, and students carried new notebooks filled with fresh hopes. Alicia stood at the center surrounded by her friends, while Clara watched from a bench, her smile soft and satisfied. David's hand rested gently on his daughter's shoulder, Angela's eyes shining with pride. As the sun climbed higher, warmth spilling across faces once bowed by shame, the message was undeniable. When compassion and truth stand together, even the deepest roots of prejudice can be torn from the earth, and an entire community can be reborn. In the end, this story is not just about one girl, one father, or one woman who stood against cruelty. It is about every soul who dares to rise above prejudice, who chooses compassion over silence, and who sacrifices quietly so that others may live with dignity. Their courage reminds us that change begins not with power, but with kindness and truth. I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. What does this story make you reflect on in your own life? Subscribe to this channel to continue walking with us through stories that honor silent heroes. and may God bless each of you who listens with an open heart.